Family Guy is an animated sitcom first airing in 1999. The show stars the Griffin family, with the lovable idiot dad Peter, his wife Lois, their teenagers Chris and Meg, once evil turned homosexual baby Stewie, and talking dog Brian, as we follow their everyday lives in the fictional town of Quahog. It's not very good, don't get me wrong. At one point in time it was an excellent show full of fun characters, clever jokes, and surprisingly good music.
Until we're syndicated, Fox will never let us die, please.
But something happened that shook the foundation of the show forever. It got cancelled. Twice. And each time it was brought back it got a little worse. The once likeable characters have turned into mean-spirited pricks. Clever jokes are almost non-existent, and are replaced with an influx of random, unfunny cutaway gags that are used 10 times more than in the earlier seasons. And okay, the music is still good. I used to be a fan of Family Guy. A massive fan, as a matter of fact. I watched it every night, collected the DVDs, and quoted lines constantly with friends.
Oh, bass ahoy!
But one day I just kinda stopped liking it. And I doubt it was due to getting older. After watching some of the episodes from the first 3 seasons, it's clear that as the show progressed, it lost a bit of its heart. The earlier episodes felt like you were watching actual people going through real struggles. You could sympathise and relate to the characters' plight and feel for them. But as time went on, everybody turned into obnoxious, screaming idiots, and there's only so much of that I can take before calling it a day and stop watching. And I know I'm not the only one to think this. There have been many videos of people trying to explain when and how Family Guy quote-unquote died, and while I don't exactly think there was a specific date for when this happened, I personally believe after its revival, around season 4 to 5, is when the decline started to become noticeable. Family Guy has been on a slight decline in ratings ever since season 8. It's only natural. Other similar shows such as South Park and The Simpsons are also suffering from this, but when a show has been on the air for as long as Family Guy, they might pull a desperate move like some other shows did in the past, such as either introducing or killing off one of its characters as an attempt to try and spike some interest in it. We've seen this done in the show's main competitor, The Simpsons, who have killed off countless characters in its almost 30-year run. Although most of the time when it's done it's due to necessity, because like I said, The Simpsons is almost 30 years old. People die. And when that happens to be the case, they're usually very respectful about it and try not to make a big deal within the show about the character's departure. But there have been times when The Simpsons decided to focus episodes around the character's death. For example, the voice actor for Maude Flanders, Maggie Roswell, had a pay dispute with Fox, and in response they killed that bitch off the show. Although Maude is more of a secondary character, and her leaving the show wouldn't turn too many heads. I think a great example of a show killing off a main character is South Park, with its season 5 episode Kenny Dies. It's in the name. It was shocking for audiences to see a character, who in the past has been killed multiple times in various comedic ways, be written off the show in a very serious and emotional way. But I'll talk about that episode in greater detail later, as right now the focus is on Family Guy. Let me take you back to 2013. It was a weekend night when an 11-year-old Mark had just saw a post on the Family Guy Facebook page saying that one of the Griffins would die in that night's episode. I was both worried and intrigued at who the showrunners would decide to axe. And while I didn't want it to be the case, I had already knew before the episode aired. It just didn't make sense for them to kill anyone but Brian. So I tuned into Fox that night, waited for the episode to air, and it didn't. Being fairly young at the time, I didn't realise that most shows aired in the UK much later than in America. It could have been months before I would find out. Apparently I didn't think to just look it up. A couple days later, unable to cope without knowing what happened in the episode, I resorted to the most heinous crime imaginable. Streaming the episode online. A crime which every cartoon fan likes to complain about people doing, despite most likely doing it themselves. So I sat there and watched the episode. Then the infamous scene played.
Brian, look out! Ah, Brian!
I cried. That's not me exaggerating. I'm not trying to make a joke out of this. Brian's death scene made me cry when I first saw it back in 2013. Again, I was a huge fan of Family Guy back then, so seeing one of my favourite characters being killed in such a graphic and brutal way was painful to see. This episode had that effect on many fans of the show when it aired, causing immediate backlash with Facebook groups, petitions, and tattoos. The episode currently has a 4.3 rating on IMDb, but is that because people weren't happy with Brian being killed, or because the episode was just straight up bad? Let's find out. The first issue I have of Life of Brian is something that plagues almost every episode of modern Family Guy. Basically, the episode will start with something random happening, and the characters waste 5 to 10 minutes going through this little mini episode, up until something happens at the end that kicks off the actual plot. And with how much the show relies on cutaway gags to fill time, it's obvious that this is done as filler, with Life of Brian being no different. The first 7 minutes of this 22-minute episode is spent with a pointless story about Stewie going back in time to give the Indians guns, as a means for him to want to break his time machine. This is to make sure the audience knows that Brian's death will be permanent. Then after Brian dies, the rest of the episode is spent showing how the Griffins are dealing with his death, leading to them getting a new dog, and how Stewie doesn't like the fact that everyone was so quick to forget about Brian after Vinny came into the picture. I feel like this could have created some great character moments, but it's rushed through so quickly. Stewie completely warms up to Vinny in around a minute with a scene that's just...
I hate you because now everyone has forgotten about my friend.
Did you know my friend died once?
You're my friend now. I guess you're not so bad.
Cue that fucking slow zoom Family Guy likes to do in every episode. Seriously though, with such a shift in the show's dynamic, you'd think they'd want to spend as much time as possible showing the characters and how they're dealing with the death of their dog. If only they had more time to develop the wait. But let's look at the death itself and how tasteful it is. The way they slow it down and put as much detail as possible into the animation is so disrespectful to the character, and it's clear it was meant to be that way. They want you to feel as bad as possible while watching this, trying their hardest to squeeze the emotion out of you. A problem Family Guy seems to have is that they want to have these serious moments where the audience is expected to be really invested with what's happening, only to immediately follow it up with a random out-of-place joke that undoes any tension the scene had set up.
Holy crap, what the hell happened?
That guy sucked.
I mean, if the show itself doesn't care enough to take itself seriously, then why should the audience? One thing I really can't stand is forced emotion, and this episode is full of it. For example, let's go over what we know about Brian Griffin. Well, he's a bit of a contrarian, he's a drunk, he regularly only does things for the benefit of himself, and he's alluded to the fact that he wants to kill himself. Well, in this episode, that Brian has been removed, and is replaced with a new Brian that's loving life.
God, look at this day, huh? You know, usually I'd be sitting inside writing, you'd be working on one of your machines, but here we are enjoying it.
Acting nothing like the Brian we've grown to know, and that's for one reason. If Brian was acting like, Brian in this episode, then there's a slight chance that people won't care that he's dead, which means that in this episode he has to act like he's the nicest guy in the world, in order for the audience to care. I gotta give props to the team over there though, they were able to kill off Brian and stick to their guns by keeping him dead. For a whole 2 episodes. Family Guy doesn't have the balls to kill off a major character like Brian and make it permanent, so he was brought back 2 episodes later with Christmas Guy, in honestly a pretty clever way. Seth MacFarlane admitted that Brian was always meant to come back, saying he was trying to teach a lesson about not taking what you have for granted, as it could be gone at any moment. It's just too bad that after Brian was brought back, the show continued on its downward spiral, to a point where I and many others would have preferred it if Brian stayed dead. What did they do to you? Since Brian has been brought back, he's given Stewie and Chris herpes, tricked Quagmire into buying a house after Quagmire paid for his new teeth, tried to spend time with his only son after not seeing him in years as an attempt to become a writer on a show that he acts in. And that's just to name a few examples. But don't you complain, because he can be gone at any moment. So suck it up and laugh, because if you don't, we'll just kill him again.
For 16.
Brian Griffin, the dog on Family Guy. Claire.
What, is hit by a car?
Yes.
Could Brian's death have worked though? Absolutely. Like I mentioned earlier, the episode Kenny Dies from the 5th season of South Park is very similar to this episode. To see a character like Kenny, who throughout the series has been killed various times in comedic ways, actually be killed in an extremely serious way was surprising to see. I guess where this episode succeeds and Life of Brian fails is in how the characters react to the situation. The residents of South Park take his death completely seriously and don't try to tell random jokes in between. Of course there are jokes in the episode, but they're mostly kept separate from the situation, and all the characters stay consistent throughout the episode. Whereas Family Guy doesn't know whether or not they want to take Brian's death seriously or crack a joke about it.
This is probably the worst pain I've ever had to go through. And I've sprained my ankle twice.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today.
None of you people came to my funeral.
So they do both, making it so characters 1 minute will be crying over Brian, and the next minute be making a joke about it. And you can make jokes about it if you want, but at least try to keep the characters consistent with how they feel about the death. Also, South Park doesn't have a scene of Kenny covered in blood on a hospital bed as he looks to the characters and gives a cringy and cliche, "Oh, I love you all" line. yet it still manages to be more emotional than Life of Brian. I guess what I'm getting at here is South Park has a heart, and Family Guy has dollar signs in its eyes. And I hope Seth was happy, because the episode succeeded with it receiving pretty average ratings. Come on, if you're going to have a ratings trap, at least make sure it was worth it. I doubt either him or the show as a whole will find its way back to its former glory, and who knows what other characters they'll have axed and replaced by then to try keep the show afloat. Can't wait for a cast of characters with the same tropes as the Griffin family but without any of the charm. Ah, wait. With all that being said, he may have been brought back, but to me the Brian Griffin that I grew up loving died a long, long time ago.